In 2018, the world watched two longtime enemies shake hands and believed a historic peace had finally arrived. Crowds celebrated, diplomats applauded, and less than a year later, one of those leaders was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. But behind the celebration, there was one question almost nobody asked. What actually changed? To understand what happened in 2018, you have to go back nearly 3 decades. In 1993, Eritrea officially gained independence from Ethiopia after a long and brutal war. For Ethiopia, one of Africa's oldest nations, the consequences were immediate. It became landlocked, cut off from direct access to the Red Sea. And that loss wasn't just geographic. It was economic, strategic, and for many, deeply personal. But the story didn't end there. In 1998, the two countries went to war again, this time over a small border town called Badme. 2 years of fighting, tens of thousands of lives lost. And when it ended, the core issue remained unresolved. A ceasefire was signed. A boundary commission delivered its ruling. But the decision was never fully implemented. And for the next 20 years, the two countries existed in a tense, frozen standoff. No real diplomacy, no meaningful trade, no communication. Just two armies facing each other across a heavily militarized border. That was the reality in early 2018, when a new Ethiopian prime minister came into power. And then, within just a few months, everything seemed to change. In June 2018, Ethiopia announced it would finally accept the long-disputed border ruling. It was a dramatic shift, one that few had expected. Eritrea responded quickly. Within weeks, the two leaders met. They embraced. They signed an agreement officially ending the state of war. Flights resumed. Phone lines reconnected. Families, separated for decades, crossed the border to reunite. For many, it felt like a breakthrough. And from the outside, the narrative was simple and compelling. A decades-long conflict suddenly resolved. But in geopolitics, simple narratives are rarely the full story. Because when you look more closely at what was actually agreed, something important begins to stand out. The 2018 declaration committed both sides to ending the state of war, restoring diplomatic relations, and promoting cooperation. But it did not include clear mechanisms for how those goals would be implemented. No detailed timeline, no formal verification system, no clearly defined process for resolving the core border issue. In practical terms, it was more of a political understanding than a fully structured agreement. And almost immediately, the limits of that approach began to show. The border, briefly opened in 2018, was quietly closed again within months. The expected trade flows never fully materialized. Planned economic cooperation stalled. At first, this could be interpreted as caution. After decades of hostility, a slow and careful approach might seem reasonable. But over time, the broader pattern became harder to ignore, because by 2020, the situation had shifted dramatically. When conflict erupted in northern Ethiopia, Eritrean forces became directly involved, fighting alongside Ethiopian federal forces against a shared adversary. At the time, this was framed as coordination, a temporary alignment of interests. But when the conflict formally de-escalated in 2022, expectations were that external forces would withdraw. That didn't fully happen. And since then, reports and regional analyses have suggested a more complex and evolving dynamic, one where alliances are less stable and strategic calculations are constantly shifting. Which brings us to the deeper question behind all of this. Because when you step back and look at the broader pattern, one thing becomes clear. This was never just about ending a war. It was about managing long-term power dynamics between two neighboring states with very different trajectories. From a strategic perspective, Eritrea's actions over time can be interpreted as prioritizing balance, ensuring that no single regional actor becomes overwhelmingly dominant. And in that context, a rapidly growing, increasingly assertive Ethiopia presents a unique challenge, not necessarily because of immediate intentions, but because of long-term potential, which means the relationship between these two countries isn't just shaped by the past, it's shaped by what each of them is becoming. And that changes how you interpret the events of 2018. Instead of a final resolution, the agreement begins to look more like a pause, a moment where both sides stepped back, reassessed, and repositioned, which raises a question that still doesn't get asked often enough. Did the peace process serve both sides equally, or did it create more space for one side than the other? If you closely look at what has happened since then, economic reforms, institutional changes, and broader regional engagement, it suggests that at least one country has been using that time to move forward. And today, the relationship between Ethiopia and Eritrea is often described as something in between peace and conflict. Not openly at war, but not fully at peace either. A kind of strategic equilibrium. And from the outside, the images from 2018 still stand. The handshake, the speeches, the Nobel Prize. All of it was real, but what those moments represented may have been more temporary than they appeared. Because in geopolitics, agreements don't last because they are signed. They last because both sides have a reason to sustain them. And when those underlying incentives don't fully align, even the most celebrated breakthroughs can begin to unravel over time. Now, you might be wondering, if tensions are quietly building again, why isn't Ethiopia responding more aggressively? Why choose restraint instead of confrontation? The answer to that question is where this story becomes even more interesting. Because Ethiopia is responding, just not in the way most people expect. And once you understand that strategy, the entire picture starts to shift. That's exactly what we'll break down in the next video.